Going to hit them extremely hard over the next 2 to 3 weeks.
US President Donald Trump says he expects to continue bombing Iran.
The president is warning he's ready to pick up the fighting again if no deal is reached.
Malacca Strait, southwest of Penang, near the Northern Traffic Separation Scheme. 4 to 12 in the morning. 33 fast attack craft close on a U.S. Navy transit as a joint American security team has less than 20 minutes to prevent a regional incident from becoming an international firefight. The sea lane narrows into a corridor of steel hulls, radar returns, and strict margins. Tankers move in staggered lanes under low cloud cover, their navigation lights diffused by haze and diesel exhaust. The water looks flat from a distance, but the current cuts across the shipping channel and pushes small craft unpredictably between merchant vessels. Every approach vector compresses into a few usable gaps, and every gap can close in seconds. The commanders on both sides understand the same fact. Once weapons fire starts inside one of the busiest sea lanes on Earth, containment becomes difficult. The U.S. vessel moves under standard transit posture, but nothing about the contact picture remains standard for long. Radar operators track converging groups at varying speed and spacing. Electro-optical feeds confirm armed silhouettes on multiple fast boats, some holding offset arcs while others cross the bow in deliberate patterns designed to signal control of the encounter. The Americans do not face a fixed bunker or fortified compound. They face a moving perimeter built from speed, numbers, and uncertainty. That makes the danger harder to map and harder to contain. The Iranian force relies on mass, ambiguity, and proximity. Small fast craft can use the clutter of civilian traffic, low profiles, and sharp acceleration to complicate a larger ship's options. A close-in confrontation at sea compresses decision time more than distance suggests. A boat that looks observational at one moment can become an immediate threat in the next if it cuts across the beam, attempts to blind sensors, or closes toward vulnerable points along the hull. The strategic value of the encounter lies beyond the boats themselves. Whoever controls the narrative of the strait controls a piece of regional deterrence. The American response does not depend on a single trigger puller or a single platform. It depends on layered coordination. A maritime security detachment monitors the close ring around the ship. Watch officers in combat information spaces build a live pattern of behavior, separating signaling maneuvers from potentially hostile movement. Aviation and surveillance assets outside the immediate frame extend the picture beyond the horizon line. Legal constraints, rules of engagement, and tactical necessity all compete for seconds inside the same decision cycle. For the US side, the challenge is not only survival. It is discrimination. The crew must identify intent without creating the escalation they are trying to prevent. Warning procedures, maneuver choices, and defensive readiness all have to remain visible without crossing into confusion. That balance defines professional force at sea. The ship has to show that it can defend itself immediately while still giving the other side a path to disengage. For the Iranian side, the objective appears broader than destruction. The boats press into test spacing, reaction time, and threshold discipline. Some formations hold wide and observe. Others dart closer, then break away, forcing repeated recalculation. The maneuver itself becomes the message. If the US vessel flinches, slows, or loses control of the channel, that reaction becomes useful. If it fires first under murky conditions, that also becomes useful. The encirclement works because the geometry turns every response into information. At 4:13, the first ring tightens. Several fast craft shift from shadowing patterns to intersecting tracks ahead of the ship's projected course. American watch teams mark the transition immediately and pass bearing, speed, and spacing updates to the bridge. The ship holds disciplined movement and begins measured signaling procedures. The Iranian boats answer by splitting into smaller groups and approaching from multiple angles. 1 minute into the incident, the crew moves from transit routine to controlled defensive posture. Visual warnings, bridge-to-bridge hails, and non-lethal escalation measures begin in sequence. The point is not theater. The point is record, clarity, and legal certainty. The Iranian formation tests that sequence by pushing 2 boats closer while several others widen to observe the response envelope. At 4:14, the sea lane starts to work against everyone in it. A merchant vessel on a parallel course reduces available maneuver room on one side while a second contact complicates the stern sector. The US ship cannot simply turn anywhere it wants without creating new risk. Iranian operators understand the constraint and use the traffic pattern to multiply pressure without firing a shot. The Americans respond by stabilizing course logic and preventing panic corrections. 2 minutes into the incident, the confrontation becomes a contest of timing. The closer boats vary speed rapidly, forcing repeated range assessments. The US team classifies contacts by behavior rather than appearance alone. Boats that hold steady arcs remain watch items, Boats that lunge into the projected path receive immediate priority attention. The result is a cleaner tactical picture inside a crowded environment. At 4:15, one group breaks across the bow at close distance and tries to force a visible American deviation. The bridge refuses the bait and executes only the minimum safe adjustment required by traffic separation and collision rules. That restraint matters. It denies the encircling force the dramatic image of a warship pushed fully offline. It also preserves the ship's own options for the next 30 seconds. 3 minutes into the incident, command emphasis shifts from warning to consequence management. Medical stations prepare quietly. Damage control teams verify readiness without broadcasting urgency. Weapons crews remain prepared but controlled, because discipline under observation matters as much as capability. The Iranian boats continue to circle, but they fail to produce chaos on deck or confusion on the bridge. At 4:16, sensors identify a change in the outer ring. Several additional small contacts appear to reposition in coordination with the inner group rather than moving independently with local traffic. That suggests rehearsed behavior rather than spontaneous harassment. American analysts flag the pattern and pass the assessment up the chain immediately. The encirclement now looks designed to probe command thresholds, not just presence. 4 minutes into the incident, the Americans widen the frame. The close boats remain dangerous, but the larger threat lies in synchronized movement across multiple rings. The ship's team stops treating the closest craft as isolated irritants and begins reading the contact picture as a managed action. That interpretation changes priorities. The goal becomes preserving navigational control, evidentiary clarity, and a credible deterrent posture at the same time. At 4:17, the nearest Iranian boats attempt a sharper intimidation pass. They close, angle outward at the last moment, and throw wake across the ship's forward sector. The maneuver aims to provoke an overreaction or an embarrassed hesitation. It gets neither. The American crew tracks, logs, warns, and holds formation discipline without letting the moment fragment into individual reactions. 5 minutes into the incident, the outer picture grows more important than the spectacle near the hull. Surveillance feeds indicate that the boats are not converging randomly. They are shaping a box around the ship's likely options. Some contacts linger where a turn would open vulnerability. Others occupy sectors that force attention away from the fastest movers. The result is a temporary tactical enclosure built from movement, not fortification. At 4:18, the ship's commanders make the key decision of the encounter. They will not surrender initiative by freezing in place, and they will not surrender legitimacy by escalating blindly. The vessel maintains transit authority within the channel, keeps every warning measure documented, and signals unambiguous defensive readiness. That combination narrows the other side's leverage. If the Iranian craft want the crisis to jump to the next level, they will have to do it against a disciplined record. 6 minutes into the incident, the psychological center of gravity shifts. The Americans no longer react contact by contact. They manage the entire event as a system. Range, bearing, behavior, civilian traffic, legal posture, and external reporting all merge into a single operational picture. The speedboats still control the nearest water, but they no longer control the rhythm of decision-making. At 4:19, the closest group slows unexpectedly. That pause introduces new uncertainty, because a boat that stops pressing can be repositioning for a more dangerous move. American teams do not relax. They study stern sectors, quarter approaches, and the gaps between merchant traffic. The encirclement remains active even when the visible pressure appears to soften. 7 minutes into the incident, a second maneuver begins from an unexpected direction. While attention centers on the bow group, additional fast craft creep in along a merchant vessel's visual clutter line. The move attempts to exploit masking rather than speed. It fails to surprise the Americans because the wider contact picture has already been built and updated continuously. The ship adjusts attention and maintains coherent coverage across all sectors. At 4:20, command communications extend beyond the immediate vessel. Regional authorities, Allied watchers, and higher headquarters receive synchronized reporting. That matters because maritime confrontations do not end at the rail. They continue into archives, broadcasts, diplomatic channels, and deterrence calculations. The Americans understand that if force is used, the first fight afterward will be over what happened and why. 8 minutes into the incident, the encounter reaches its most unstable point so far. Multiple Iranian boats now operate within distances that leave little room for misread intent. A hard turn, a sudden acceleration, or a visible weapon posture could force immediate defensive action. The American ship answers that instability with repetition and control. Procedures remain consistent, signals remain clear, and the record remains intact. At 4:21, the strait itself imposes a deadline. In a few minutes, The vessel will enter a section where traffic density and geographic constraints reduce options even further. That narrowing window raises the stakes for everyone involved. If the Iranian boats intend to force a crisis, this is the time to do it. If the Americans intend to carry the transit through without ceding control, they have to do it now. 9 minutes into the incident, the US side begins to regain visible space. The ship's controlled advance, combined with unbroken warning procedure and stable maneuvering, starts to pull the geometry out of the attacker's favor. The speedboats can still swarm, but they cannot create the image of helplessness they appeared to want. Every minute without panic reduces the value of the encirclement. At 4:22, one cluster attempts a final aggressive crossing pattern near the ship's forward track. The move seeks either a forced break in the US course or a visible last-second defensive spasm. Instead, the ship preserves line, uses limited maneuver only where navigation requires it, and continues presenting a disciplined defensive front. The Iranian boats peel off just enough to avoid a collision without gaining the reaction they came to trigger. 10 minutes into the incident, the Americans identify the larger truth of the event. This is not a boarding attempt, not a random local provocation, and not an immediate strike profile in the conventional sense. It is a test of command steadiness under layered maritime pressure. That does not make it harmless. It makes it strategically deliberate. At 4:23, the contact density begins to loosen at the edges. Outer boats widen first, creating more room between sectors. The inner ring stays close a little longer, as if preserving the image of control for one last pass. But the pressure has changed. The US ship now occupies the center without appearing trapped inside it. 11 minutes into the incident, deterrence starts to show its real mechanism. It is not noise. It is not speed. It is not posture alone. Deterrence is the combination of capability, restraint, and documentation applied without interruption under pressure. The Americans do not win the moment by firing. They win it by making escalation unattractive and miscalculation difficult. At 4:24, the nearest boats begin to separate by larger intervals. Their movement no longer supports a tight encirclement. Instead, it resembles phased disengagement with enough ambiguity to avoid looking like retreat. That distinction matters to the Iranian side. Signaling strength matters in these waters, even when the practical decision is to pull back. The Americans do not chase the optics. They maintain transit discipline and let the geometry unwind. 12 minutes into the incident, the core objective becomes clear: finish the passage without collision, without unauthorized escalation, and without surrendering legal or tactical control. That objective remains intact. The speedboats retain the ability to harass, but the decisive moment has already passed. They failed to generate panic, failed to force a reckless response, and failed to fracture the American command cycle. At 4:25, the ship crosses into a slightly more favorable traffic picture. Merchant spacing opens enough to restore maneuver margin, and that extra margin changes the entire encounter. The Iranian boats still matter, but they matter less. Space at sea is leverage. Once the Americans regain it, the encirclement loses much of its coercive effect. 13 minutes into the incident, the Americans consolidate their advantage by doing almost nothing dramatic. That restraint becomes the point. No impulsive turn. No retaliatory chase. No disorder on visible stations. The ship simply continues, fully alert, fully prepared, and increasingly difficult to corner. At 4:26, two final boats linger inside a range that keeps the scene tense for another minute. They hold position, then angle away without committing to another crossing attempt. Their withdrawal confirms what the previous minute suggested. The confrontation has shifted from pressure to observation. The window for decisive coercion has closed. 14 minutes into the incident, the record already outlasts the maneuver. Logs, feeds, radio procedures, radar tracks, and witness reporting now define the event beyond the water itself. The Iranian craft succeeded in forcing a close encounter inside one of the world's most sensitive maritime corridors. They failed to turn that encounter into a tactical or political victory. At 4:27, the swarm breaks into smaller packets and drifts outward toward less restrictive sectors. The ship's crew keeps every station focused until the last contact opens sufficiently. No one declares the event over too early. Maritime incidents often become dangerous again precisely when one side assumes the tension has passed. The Americans treat disengagement as another phase to manage, not a cue to relax. 15 minutes into the incident, the crisis enters its final stretch. The US vessel remains on course. The small craft no longer sustain a truce around. The channel opens ahead by degrees, and with it the margin for error that had nearly vanished earlier. The result is simple. The ship transits, the pressure recedes, and the confrontation ends without the explosive outcome the geometry once threatened. At 4:28, commanders begin the second battle, interpretation. What did the maneuver seek to prove? Who controlled the encounter? What threshold was tested, and what threshold held? Those questions travel faster than any speedboat once the footage reaches capitals, commands, and analysts. In modern maritime confrontations, the narrative follows within minutes. 16 minutes into the incident, the answer starts to settle. The Iranian boats demonstrated reach, coordination, and willingness to operate aggressively inside constricted waters. The Americans demonstrated that disciplined force can absorb pressure without surrendering either readiness or judgment. Neither side needed a missile launch to communicate. The encounter itself served as the transmission. At 4:29, the last close contacts widen beyond immediate concern. The U.S. ship transitions from incident management to sustained vigilance, because one safe minute at sea never guarantees the next. Still, the decisive phase is over. The transit continues under American control, not because the threat disappeared, but because the crew managed it correctly from the first compressed moments onward. 17 minutes into the incident, the operational lesson becomes clear for any navy that studies narrow seas. Small craft can swarm a larger ship and impose stress, but stress alone does not equal dominance. A professional crew can defeat coercion by preserving tempo, maintaining evidence, and refusing to confuse restraint with weakness. That is how close incidents end without surrendering deterrence. At 4:30, dawn begins to press against the eastern cloud layer. The outlines of the boats flatten into the general traffic picture. The warship remains underway, the channel remains open, and the incident moves from immediate hazard into recorded fact. The sea does not explain intent. It only records consequences for those who fail to manage it. 18 minutes into the incident, the final assessment leaves little room for exaggeration. 33 Iranian speedboats created a surround. They tested reaction time, navigational discipline, and escalation thresholds in a crowded strategic corridor. The U.S. Navy ship held course, held readiness, and denied them the crisis they tried to shape.